Hello, my sewing friends. Today I am cutting out a pair of pajama pants for my son. I'm using Simplicity 1037. This is actually a costume pattern for a ninja costume. That's what James was for Halloween. But the pants are just a simple pair of elastic waist pants that will work great for pajama pants. So a couple things that I want to do before cutting this out. I knew that I was going to use this pants pattern many times. I'm going to make a lot of pajama pants for James this year. So I backed it with French fuse. This is a lightweight, fusible interfacing, and I just pressed it on using a pressing cloth between my iron and the French fuse in the pattern. And it stabilized it and made it really stable and secure. This is going to last for years now. So now let's talk about the fabric. This is a Star Wars novelty print. It does have a stripe, and it also has a directional quality. So it's got faces that are all facing the same direction. So I just want to make sure that all those faces are facing that direction on both legs when I cut out the pieces. So what I did was I took the two pieces of fabric, I cut them apart, and then I've made sure that they're both facing the same way so that the people's faces are not like upside down on one side of the leg and right side up on the other side. Okay, so a few things about working with stripes. You kind of want to make sure that they're lined up. And so as I line this up along this edge, I'm just making sure that those stripes are nicely aligned. I'm not going to get too picky about this simply because this is a pair of pajama pants. I'm not entering a competition with them or anything. It's just something for James to wear, and he's not at all judgmental. So just going to smooth it out and lay out my pattern. So when laying out a pattern, what's really important is this line. This is your grain line, and this needs to line up equal distance from the selvage edge of your fabric. Let me slide this down so you can see. The selvage edge of your fabric is the edge that is usually a little denser woven or has writing printed on it. Usually writing, sometimes it's like little dots of color, all kinds of different things. So that's the selvage edge of your fabric. And what we're going to do, take my tape measure, and I'm going to measure from that line to the selvage edge, and I'm going to nudge it down just a bit because I don't want to waste any fabric here. And I'm getting 9.5 inches in that measurement. Now I want to go to the other end, and I want to make sure, just nudge it just a little bit, that it is also 9.5 inches. Now why am I doing this? What this is doing is this is making sure that this line is parallel with the selvage. And that is it making sure that the fabric, the grain line of the fabric is running straight with the pants pattern. If you get it off, like let's say it was tilted, or you had like a small piece of fabric and you were trying to make it fit and you kind of angled it slightly or even angled it a lot, that would mean that you were not cutting on grain. You'd be cutting slightly on the bias. These pieces would be a lot more wiggly wobbly and likely to stretch and probably not fit together well, and also when worn, probably not feel all that good either. So woven fabric and having that grain line running this way means that the waist is going to be perpendicular so that the least amount of stretch in the fabric is going to be down the leg and across the waist. That's what you want. Okay, so now that this is laid out and this looks good, I can start pinning. I don't do a lot of pinning when I'm cutting out a garment. I like to use pattern weights over pens. But I'm this is not where I usually cut out garments. I usually have a much bigger mat and rotary cutter area. So I'm going to pin this time simply because of the way I'm going to be cutting using a smaller rotary cutter and mat than I usually do. So I'm just going to pop pins in all around. And I must say, having the pattern stabilized with French fuse makes such a difference. Working with a tissue paper pattern, it's so delicate. Having it stabilized, even if it's, just whatever interfacing you've got on hand, it really will make it last so much longer and make it easier to work with. So now that my pattern is pinned to the fabric, and it's pinned through both layers of the fabric, so it's all holding together nice and securely, I'm going to slide my cutting mat underneath This is why I bothered with penning, because I didn't want this to shift and get all wonky. Okay, so now I'm just using a normal rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut along these lines. I'm going to cut along the curves first, and then when I get to the straight lines, I'll be able to use a quilting ruler to keep that line nice and straight. So I'm left-handed, and I'm just carefully running along that line. I'm being very careful to keep this hand a distance away so I don't actually accidentally, slide it too fast forward and cut myself. I don't want to do that. When I was inserting those pins, I was really careful not to insert them off the edge over that, outer line for the 8-inch mark. I didn't want to cut through any of my pins. Hit those with my rotary cutter. Even still, my blade's not the sharpest today. I should probably change blades. I had to go in there and clean up a few nicks here and there. Okay, so I'm going to work my way around, and because it's pinned, I can do this. I can just pick it up and flop it around however I need to in order to get around and cut out all of these areas. Now, don't worry about the notches. This is something that I learned while sewing professionally for many years, is that notches are a pain in the butt to cut, and they're really a waste of time, because most of these patterns you have 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance, and that means that you can get away with simply clipping the notches inward rather than outward. So here you can see it would be such a pain to have to go in here and notch those out, especially when I'm cutting across so quickly with the rotary cutter. So instead what I do is I cut it off flush with the edge, and then I go in and just snip with the tip of my scissors right into that area. You want to kind of hold it all nice and straight and parallel, and then just snip in. And you're not snipping in much. I mean, it's a really, really tiny amount, but that will still mark that place. That's the purpose, is to mark that place on the fabric so that you know how to line things up when you're stitching that seam. And so by clipping it out that way, number one, it's quicker, and number two, you can match it up that much easier when you're sewing. So here's an example of a line that I can cut using my quilting ruler for assistance. And I just line up that straight line with the straight edge of my ruler, and I want to press and hold it down really firmly because I've got needles, I've got pins underneath this ruler that are causing it to, press upward, so it's not going to get as nice a grip on the fabric and pattern as it would with those pins out of the way. So I have to be really careful not to let that ruler slip. I can shift it down, line it up, press, and cut. So I'm just going to finish cutting out this pattern all the way around, and I'll meet you back here when I've got it cut out and ready to sew. So here are the two legs to James's pajama pants, and I have already finished this leg. And what we're going to do is stitch the seam line, then finish the edge with a zigzag stitch, and then also finish the hem. So I'm holding these fabrics right sides together. That means that the right printed side is to the inside, and I'm also matching up that little clipped out notch. Now I'm going to stitch this with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And here's something that's important, is to pay attention to the lines on your sewing machine. On your needle plate there's going to be markings, and I have a mark right here that's very close to 5/8 of an inch. I need to go just a little bit beyond it to be right on the 5/8 inch mark. So I'm just going to start stitching. I have set my stitch length, that's the length of the stitches, to 1.6 millimeters. That's going to produce a nice, secure, stable stitch. I want these to wear really well. That's why I cut them out a bit big, so that James could wear them for a lot longer than usual. When it comes to maintaining an accurate seam allowance, it really just is keeping an eye on those marks on your needle plate, and also being vigilant about keeping the edges of your fabric in line. Even you just have to stop and kind of nudge it over. You probably noticed that I don't pin. This is just a carryover from when I sewed garments professionally. I was sewing, 50 to 60 garments a week, and I got out of the habit of pinning because pinning was time consuming. And I would basically just buzz through a seam. As long as things lined up well at the beginning, they would usually line up well by the end. And that's just a trick that I learned when I sewed that much. And it also does make it a little faster. You can just buzz through these seams without having to stop constantly and take out pins. As I near the bottom, I just kind of line up the bottom edge and then press out any bubbliness on one side of the fabric or the other and just kind of smooth it out, and then the layers will evenly feed together and it'll work out just right. Even if one side does end up a little longer than the other, it's not the end of the world. There we go. Let's just cut it off. So now I'm going to go back to the beginning and I'm going to switch to a zigzag stitch. And I'm going to move that zigzag stitch over to the right, and that way it's as far a right swing as it can be. And then I'm also going to position my presser foot so that's right along the stitching line that I've just stitched. So the needle will be swinging way over, and that will produce a really nice zigzag stitch that's going to finish off the seam line. I'm also going to dial down my zigzag stitch to be, it's going to be 3 millimeters wide and 1.4 millimeters long, and that's going to produce a nice tidy zigzag stitch. It really is one of those things, it depends entirely on your opinion and what you think looks good on your garments. If you want a little bit more of a narrow zigzag or a little wider, it's totally up to you. I would definitely play with it on a little scrap just to see what you like, and definitely try anything out on a little scrap before you start stitching on your garment. That's a really important tip. Anything that will avoid having to be ripped out if you don't like it, that's the most important thing. So now we have a nice zigzag stitch and our seam line, and we're just going to trim close to that zigzag stitch with our scissors. I don't want to catch the stitching, I just want to trim close to it. So I've turned the pants now right sides out, and I'm going to go on ahead and finish the hem. You could do this at any point, you could do this at the very end, but I kind of like to do it right here while I'm working on just each pant leg singly. So what I'm going to do is just turn under 1/4 inch, and a really helpful tool is to have a little seam gauge like this, and you can double check yourself, position this onto 1/4 inch and make sure it's right. You could pen it, but I can eyeball 1/4 inch in my sleep because I'm a quilter, so I can definitely see that that's 1/4 inch, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch and fold at the same time, and that's going to produce a really narrow little hem, and then I'll go around again as I fold it up to do a 1 inch hem. So I'm going to switch to a single stitch, and I'm just going to start stitching, pretty much lining up the fabric, the fold in the fabric with kind of this clear part of my foot. And so it's a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm not edge stitching, it's a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. And as I go, I'm folding it over 1/2 of an inch and then stitching pretty much right through the middle of it. Kind of nice as you come around, the point that you started can kind of help you guide the fold. You just give it a little tug and you see how the fabric wants to fold over. Just press it softly with your finger and it's just exactly where it needs to be. I just cross over my stitches a bit. If you want to, you can do a little bit of reversing here. It's not really all that important because this is going to get stitched over again. So now I'm going to take the hem and fold it up 1 inch. And just check it with my seam gauge. That looks good. And press it firmly with my fingers and just slide it right under the machine. And I'm just lining up the needle with my previous line of stitching. And I'm just going to stitch right on top of that line of stitching. And as I go, I'll fold up, check my hem, make sure that I'm at 1 inch, and stitch right on top of that previous stitching. I find this really easy because, you know, as long as the stitching before was nice and straight, then this stitching will be nice and straight. And it's just really easy. I like to avoid having to get up and grab my iron and press things and be really exact, especially when I'm speed sewing something like this. I just want to be able to whip it out the least amount that you have to get up and mess around with your iron or cut something off or pen, the faster you will stitch. So again, here I'm at this point. This is the starting point. I can just give this a little tug and this will all smooth out and be exactly where it needs to be. And just focus on stitching right on top of that previous stitching line. Now on this, I really do want to do a few back stitches just to secure it. And trim off my thread tails. And that is the finished hem. So here are my 2 finished pant legs, and it's time to sew that last crotch seam, I guess is the best way to call it. So I have 1 pant leg right side out and 1 pant leg wrong side out, and I'm going to take them and grab the right pant leg and put it inside. Just pull it in, and then I'm going to line up the fabric right sides together. And what this should allow me to do is line up the notches that we clipped out to guide where these seams should go, how they should match up. So here I've got 2 notches, I'm lining those up together. I am going to pin right here, and that's going to be the center front. And then I just kind of shake it out a little bit, get it reoriented, and I line up the 3 clipped out notches to create the back, and pop a pin in there too. And then the only other thing left to match is the seams of the pant legs themselves. And what's really good to do is have 1 pressed in one direction and 1 pressed in the opposite direction. And that just reduces a little bit of the bulk in that area. Okay, so that's lining up nicely. Pop a pin in there and we're ready to stitch. So I've got these notches pinned here, and from there I can line up the edges of the fabric up to basically the top edge where the waistband's going to be. Line that up nicely and slide it under my presser foot. And again, I got to remember that 5/8 of an inch where that is on my machine. Another thing, my machine doesn't remember the stitch length whenever I switch it to something else, so I always have to remember to go back and remind it that I want to stitch with a smaller stitch length. I'm stitching with a 1.6 stitch length. I'll stitch down, get close to the pin and take it out. Oop. And then usually what I'll do is just as I take out 1 pin, I'll kind of lay everything out and smooth it out so it's nice and aligned before stitching further down. This is why it's really nice to have your machine in a flatbed table so you have the space in the front to lay everything nice and flat. Perfect. So now I'm just going to take it and flip right back over and switch back to my zigzag stitch. And that's going to finish off the seam so it doesn't fray when it's being washed. Okay, and just like the pants leg, I'm just going to take my scissors and trim down right to the edge of that zigzag, just finishing off that seam, keep making it a little narrower, but still going to wear really, really well. So now's the moment of truth. I reach in and grab that other leg and pull it out. And this is looking good. I can turn the whole thing right side out. Oh, it's so soft. This flannel is just super, super soft. One thing when sewing with flannel, you really want to make sure to pre-wash it in hot water before cutting out your pattern, simply because flannel is so prone to shrinking. So there's the pajama pants so far. The next step is to finish off the waistband. We're going to insert some elastic and tighten this up so that way it fits my son's waist. So the first thing I like to do when finishing the waistband is to insert a little piece of fabric and also finish off this edge. And what the little piece of fabric is doing is it's the same thing as the little tag on the back of your pants. It tells you what's the front and what's the back. It's kind of helpful. And I like it because it's really hard to tell the front from the back on pants like this unless you keep it marked. And then finishing off this top edge is going to allow us to really easily finish off these pants with some elastic waist. So I've grabbed a piece of 1-inch elastic and I wrapped this around my son's waist and brought it in by 1 inch just to make sure that was going to fit really nicely. And do understand that elastic like this will stretch as you're sewing it into the garment. So I'm going to just place this underneath the foot and I'm going to stitch basically a box all around. I'm overlapping those 2 ends by 1 inch. So I'm going to stitch a little box all around and then I'm going to stitch an X through the middle of the box. And that just ensures that this elastic is going to stay together really nice and tight. It's never going to come undone. So now I'm doing the X. It really doesn't matter what the stitching looks like. You could even be contrasting thread. Just happen to be lucky here and have white thread in the machine. It really doesn't matter because this is going to be completely encased. Okay, so I break my thread. So taking my pair of pants, what I'm going to do is place the piece of elastic to the back and fold over that top waistband. And I want to fold it over and leave 1/4 inch of space that is past that waistband. So really I'm folding this over a total of 1.25 inches. And I can check that with my seam guide right here. Just place this on and I feel like I've got it right. Here's one important thing to do right here, and that is to put some pins going through the elastic through the fabric. We want this to hold in place really tightly right there. We don't want it to move because otherwise that connection where it's double layered could move around and it's just it feels kind of weird when it shifts around the waistband and it ends up on the side or something. It feels a lot more natural if it's on the back. Okay, so this looks good. I'm going to start to encase it on the machine. So I'm going to slide the pants under the foot. And what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of feeling where the elastic is underneath the fabric, and I should have like 1/4 inch here on the edge, and I want to stitch along that 1/4 inch area, not through the elastic. I want the elastic to remain free as we encase it. So I'm just going to get started stitching and take a few stitches and then back stitch. Okay. And then as I go, I'm going to spread this out, make sure that that elastic is deep in that fold. Double check my fold is accurate. It's a little bit big right now, so just kind of sit there and nudge it and play with it until you get it just right. That looks good. Okay, so I'm just going to start stitching. Okay, once you stitch a few inches, just stop and take your time repositioning and get it just right. This is the trickiest part, I think, of the pants, any kind of elastic waist pants, is just getting the elastic in there nicely so it doesn't get lumpy or you don't catch the elastic, and also getting it nicely fitted. So you can see as I go, I just kind of keep pulling towards myself. And then at this point, what I want to do is just start tugging that elastic forward. You can see it starts to ruche up back here. Don't worry about that. Your foot's down. It's kind of holding all that excess fabric behind the foot. Just don't want to twist your elastic as you do this. And keep it nice and flat. Okay, once you get it flat, then double check that your elastic is deep in that fold. You've got a flat space. I'm kind of ending up a little bit big on a 1.5 inch fold over, but I think that's going to be fine. Not the end of the world. So I'm coming right back to the end, and I've got my 2 pins here. Do not remove them. It's very tempting. You think, oh, I'm coming to the end. I don't need that anymore. No, leave them in because they're still holding that elastic exactly into place so that where the elastic came together is right where it needs to be. And it's a little tricky because right at this point, I need to stitch over those needles, those pens. So I'm going to shift them to the side so that I can stitch over this area. There we go. And then see how this is just a little baggy and a little puffy? I'm just giving it a little tug, and that's smoothing everything down flat, but I'm still not stitching through the elastic itself. Met up with my previous stitching, and then I'm backing up. Okay, so the next step is to evenly move the fabric around the elastic. This is why we didn't want to catch the elastic in that fabric as we were stitching on the first run around, because you really want it to be consistent and evenly distributed all the way around. And this would prevent, you having all of the fabric on one side, like let's say, all of it was stretched over to the right hip, and then you didn't have any on the left side. That would be a little inconsistent and probably feel pretty weird to wear. So how I do this is I stretch it out, and remember I kept these pins in the back. That's still holding that elastic nice and firmly right here in the back. That's where that joint is positioned. And so now I'm stretching, and that's ensuring that the fabric is evenly distributed all around the elastic waistband. And now I'm going to work my hands over and just pinch right here. I'm just holding the fabric and the elastic securely right there, and I'm going to insert another pin right there. And what this is just going to ensure is that the elastic stays evenly distributed throughout the waistband. And now this should be fairly even. I can also do the same thing on the sides, just pull it flat, work my fingers over, pinch, and insert a pin. And do the same thing on the opposite side. As we go through and stitch over this now, the fabric will stretch and stitch through it to secure the elastic in place. And this ensures that the fabric is going to be even throughout the waistband. You can see how nice that looks. It's very consistent. When James wears this, it's going to consistently hang down his legs and not feel like, like I said, there's tons of fabric on one side or whatever. Okay, so now this is ready to stitch. Now I usually do this step with the right side facing up, so I turn the pants inside out so it would be easier to get to this area. And what I'm going to do is just slide it, starting in the back, and I usually look at something on my foot to guide. So right here I'm just using the edge of my foot along the edge of the pants and just lining up just like that. I drop my needle down and bring my bobbin thread up to the surface. I'm doing that just to stop it from making a mess on the back of the pants. Okay, so I'm going to start stitching, do a little back stitch. Okay, and then as I go, I can now start taking out these pins. But here's the important thing. I took out that first pin that was holding the elastic in place, but I've got this next pin that's holding it to the side. I'm going to leave this in place, take the pants and pull. And as I pull and hold it flat, I'm just going to stitch straight down. What this is doing is it's pulling the elastic, it's stretching the elastic and allowing the fabric to be stitched on without any wrinkles in it. The elastic's what's going to do the gathering now, and the fabric's just coming along for the ride. I'll pull out that pin, and I've got my next pin. This is the front seam. Again, I'll take it and pull, getting the fabric nice and flat, stretching the elastic as I go. Now you might be worried, will this, stretch the elastic out of shape? Will suddenly my pants not fit? Something like that. This is why we cut the elastic 1 inch smaller, actually, 1 inch to 2 inches. It just really depends on what the fit that you're wanting. Smaller than the waist. And then we used 1 inch of that in order to connect the ends together. Because as you're stitching through it and stretching like this, you are going to add a little bit more length to the elastic. It is going to become a little bit bigger as you stitch. But here's another cool tip, is that if you take this to your iron and steam it, the steam will actually cause the elastic to tighten up and shrink back down to its original size. So that's a cool tip. You can always use steam to encourage the fabric to do what you want. I've got one last little spot right here. Take out my last pin and match back up with my initial stitching. Do a little back stitch. Okay, so now we have a nicely gathered and stitched waistband. You could probably stop here, but if you really wanted a nice professional finish, just stitch through it one more time. And this time, I'm going to position it a little lower, and I'm lining up the opposite edge of my foot with that first stitching line that we did to encase the elastic. I always like, just picking something that's easy that I can line up my foot with so I don't have to guess. I don't have to measure anything, just stick it on there and stitch. And because we already have that first line of stitching in place, we don't have any pins to worry about either. So as I go, I'm just stopping and giving, putting one hand back in the back, right here, and putting one hand in the front, and I stretch, make sure I keep it flat so I can see, stretch and stitch. So here's our finished pants. These cute pajama pants are ready to be worn. They're super soft and nicely finished, and the waistband is going to fit great. Now, if you make this pair of pants and you find that the waistbands come a little stretched and doesn't quite fit your kid, just take it to your ironing board and turn on your iron to the steam setting and lightly steam the waistband. The elastic, which could have become a little stretched out as you were stitching it, will definitely shrink back in. You can even just see it shrink back in again, and it'll fit perfectly. So definitely have fun making your own pajama pants. And subscribe to our videos here on YouTube so you don't miss out on any cool quilting or sewing videos coming out weekly.